I'm so glad to see you guys here. Some of you know me, but most of you don't. My name is Sarah Lopez, and I'm new faculty here in the Weitzman School of Design. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Mike Amezcua, Associate Professor of History and member of the Global Cities Initiative at Georgetown University, to the Weitzman School of Design. Amezcua was invited by the Department of City and Regional Planning before I arrived, which is evidence of the extent to which the department has its finger on not only the pulse of Latinx urban history, but also urban and American histories more broadly, because I think we can argue that the work that he's doing helps to sort of push those histories to the center. He is the author of a masterful book, Making Mexican Chicago from Postwar Settlement to the Age of Gentrification, which won the first book award, that's what it's called, by the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. The work takes us from the 1950s forward to many different neighborhoods across Chicago, where Mexicans and Mexican Americans were not only continually displaced, but also active producers of creating vital and lasting landscapes. So displacement and or alongside production can lead to tensions and paradoxes that are explored through a range of actors in his story: everyday working people in Little Village, Pilsen, back of the yard, bureaucrats, planners, politicians, businesswomen. So today he's going to share with us a short 15-minute or so presentation on only one portion of the book. And then him and I are going to settle into a conversation about the book more broadly and open it up to questions to you as well. I also want to finally and lastly add that Amezcua is a public intellectual. And what that means is that he publishes for a broader audience in newspaper articles and journals such as the Washington Post, Teen Vogue, Public Books, Zocalo Public Square, and most recently this article, quote, "How a Little Mexican Church Soon to Close Became a Refuge from Discrimination for 76 Years" in the Chicago Sun-Times. So even the title of that is so intriguing to me. Maybe we should just switch your talk.
Right.
So please join me in welcoming Mike to the podium. Thank you.
All right, how's everyone doing? Good? Fantastic. I'm gonna time myself so that I don't go on for too long. I am a professor and we tend to ramble and talk for a long time. But it's so great to be here. I'm so thankful to you for being here. And of course to Professor Sarah Lopez. My God, what an amazing get to have her here. Take her classes, learn from her, visit her during office hours, as I would if I were a student here. Let me start by thanking my host, the Department of City and Regional Planning, in particular Lisa Servin, Sarah Lopez, Francesca Aman, Kate Daniel, and Patrick Bransfield for helping me with my visit. This is my first talk ever at a school of design, which is very exciting for me, but also it reminds me of when I was an undergrad at UCLA. I would kind of like discover urban planning classes and architectural history classes. And my feeling when I was in those classes was, where have you been all my life? It was just like, that's like, these are my people. So this is extremely exciting for me. So thank you so much for the invitation. It means the world to me. I'd like to give a brief overview of the book, and then zoom into a moment in the 1970s and 80s, as Sarah said, that illustrates how private market forces, with help from municipal officials, descended on Latinx working class neighborhoods to try to turn them into luxury enclaves, and then the community mobilization that resulted from that threat. My book, Making Mexican Chicago, is at its core a book about the creation of America's third housing market. Not white or black, but Latinx. That market, like most housing markets, was created by a variety of stakeholders. So you can imagine real estate agents, community leaders, parish groups, city officials. And these groups carved out in direct relationship the space in an already existing segregated city, on top of layers of pre-existing racialized exclusion, discrimination, and profiteering. The book begins with urban renewal in the mid-century years and closes with neoliberal urban investment in the late 20th century, illuminating the struggle between ethnic Mexicans and the external forces of municipal government, the private sphere, and the city's enduring white backlash politics that shaped Mexican space in the Windy City. This map roughly covers the neighborhoods that I cover in the book. And you can imagine that in the book, I sort of moved from the near west side, which is the neighborhood closest to the loop or downtown, and then I make my way southwest side into the other communities throughout the second half of the 20th century. In the book, I argue that it is impossible to understand Latinx urban development or even urbanism without accounting for the immigration control regime, I can unpack that a little further down the road, that conditioned life for urban Latinx peoples for most of the 20th century. So for instance, in the book, I show how at the same time that plans for urban renewal were taking shape in Chicago, that's the very same time that a mass deportation campaign by the federal government targeting undocumented Mexicans was brought to the city. These two interlocking forces or systems produced demolition and deportation that not only displaced Mexican communities, but shaped their politics of placemaking for years to come, and I argue for the rest of the 20th century. So let me take us to a meeting of neighbors that took place 40 years ago in 1983. Don't fall asleep, just stick with me, in which the Mexican community in Pilsen was talking about gentrification. The meeting was held by a group called the Pilsen Aslan Neighborhood Coalition. I don't have a photo of the size of the meeting, but this photo doesn't quite do it justice. You can imagine that inside the hall, there are residents, renters, just people from the community concerned about, one, what the word gentrification means, and two, will I be displaced? Will it affect me personally? One of the people speaking at that meeting was an activist by the name of Miguel Centeno, and he asked, how did we get here? And it was a rhetorical question. He answered, whether your grandparents were brought here by the railroads to work in the steel mills or in the meat packing plants, or you were smuggled in on the back of a pickup truck. Mexicanos built this city. We deserve a place in it. End of quote. Centeno gave a history lesson on Mexican immigration to the US, but extended that lesson to the politics of urban development. Quote, 10 years ago, the city's master plan threatened to wipe us out, end of quote. So Centeno reminded the residents that earlier in 1973, so now I'm taking you even further back, there was a master plan by the city called Chicago 21. The name Chicago 21 was the name given to the plan because the planners were thinking about Chicago not only in the 2020s, but in the 21st century. What will it look like? And how can we shape that vision? This 1973 master plan was written about all over in newspapers and in particular in places like the Architectural Forum. And this is what they wrote about it. This is an ambitious vision of the city in the tradition of Daniel Burnham. This is like an early planner of Chicago, to rejuvenate a declining inner city. It's cautiously conceived, and its plan was to integrate infrastructure to create a kind of super loop. So a loop around the downtown loop, integrating kind of fringe areas with the downtown core. The architectural renderings provoked oohs and ahs from those observing this kind of new master plan. One of the renderings shows Pilsen as having this kind of green belt, these trees that line these kind of walkways. And then one of the other images shows a kind of river promenade that connects these communities, not just Pilsen, but also Chinatown, which kind of neighbors it, along the south branch of the Chicago River that then feeds into the downtown core. Back then, Pilsen activists were horrified by these renderings and talks of Chicago 21. And they joined a kind of citywide effort to mobilize against this plan. Direct action protests took place all over the city. Massive marches were organized from Pilsen to City Hall, hence the cover of my book. And they filled the streets of downtown as they pushed back on the plans to remake Pilsen into a site for luxury condominiums. One of the land developers that was really pushing Chicago 21 was a guy by the name James Downs. He was its most strident booster, and he himself played multiple roles. Those roles kind of were full of conflicts of interest. He was a land developer. He was a municipal official. He was head of an organization called the Chicago Real Estate Research Corps. And that organization is a notorious group for Chicago urbanists because that organization was the research arm of the Chicago Real Estate Board. The Real Estate Board practically invented the restrictive racial covenant in 1927. So he's part of a group that is for years has already been invested in legacies of Jim Crow segregation and then new techniques to segregate Chicago and to profit off that segregation. To add a kind of veneer of style and trendiness to Chicago 21, they hired the architectural firm Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill. But not only did they commission this firm to create Chicago 21, they talked about the firm as having been the authors of the plan to kind of give it more credibility among suburbanites. After all, suburbanites were the kind of focus, the target of the people they wanted to bring back. I want to briefly mention another guy, Lewis Hill. He was the head of Chicago's Department of City Planning. He also played multiple roles. But in the barrio, he'll never be remembered as a noble civil servant. He'll always be remembered as a man who placed the bulldozer's target on black and brown neighborhoods. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Hill produced a series of market analysis studies on neighborhoods like Pilsen and others to use kind of in-house within the department itself and to try to entice investors and developers with kind of sweetheart deals and the promise of little to no red tape if they invested in the rebuilding of these spaces. Some investors took them up on these offers, and they bought up portions of the South Loop and Lincoln Park. You can visit those areas. They've been radically transformed. But more nefarious, and I'll try to speak a little quicker here, was the predatory culture of the Chicago Department of City Planning, which the very producers of these studies went out into the neighborhoods to purchase buildings and land for their own personal gain, sites where the department had forecasted future investments. In Pilsen, one of those land barons was a man by the name of John Podmajersky, pictured here on the cover of the Chicago Reader. Podmajersky worked for the city planning department, lived in a suburb, and decided to act on the intel being provided to investors. From the late 1960s into the 1970s, he personally purchased hundreds of buildings on the eastern end of Pilsen. Mostly the buildings were in poor condition, owned by slumlords, but they also served as vital rental apartments to Mexican families. Podmajersky had family roots in Pilsen, as his parents and grandparents had settled there from Eastern Europe, hence the name Pilsen, a major metropolis in the Czech Republic. And like many suburbanites with urban roots, had subscribed to a narrative of Chicago as having been changed in a more kind of negative way. You might know the talk. It's usually something like the city's really gone to, S. More than nostalgia, however, in buying up all of these properties, Podmajersky had unmistakable cultural and political aims. He wanted to forge an artist's colony in East Pilsen, a kind of bohemian utopia of painters, sculptors, glass and woodworkers, even actors and singers. He recruited artists from all over with cheap rents and the space to hone their craft. With his army of artists, Podmajersky became a kind of folk hero for a pre-industrial past, making space for art within the rubble of deindustrialization. Only problem was that there was no place for Mexicans or Latinx people in his version of Pilsen. This is why he became the subject of the cover story for The Reader in 1978. The writers of The Reader held him up as an old crank with folksy attributes, but also as a hard-nosed investor and real estate speculator who single-handedly was trying to displace and erase Mexican Pilsen one building at a time, or as the headline says, colonize Pilsen. Mexican Pilsen residents fought back against Podmajersky and his colony. Teresa Fraga, the leader of the Pilsen Neighbors Community Council, told the media, Mexican families are large, and indeed some of the newspaper articles about Teresa Fraga do in fact show her large family in front of their building in Pilsen. But Podmajersky knows that, and he won't rent to us. He discriminates against us because of our families. Another activist wrote, he bullies Mexican homeowners using his connections with the city to find code violations until they're forced to sell. One Chicano artist said, quote, he forgets or doesn't care that we are artists too. And in fact, Pilsen in the 1960s and 70s was the ground zero for a Chicano muralist movement, the largest outside of the Southwest. Colorful murals began to adorn the 19th century worker cottages and bungalows of the neighborhood. This image shows muralist Ray Patlan painting a new mural at House Settlement House, a building that in the 1960s and 70s was liberated and renamed Casa Aslan, the mythical homeland of Chicanas and Chicanos. Podmajersky, too, did not speak in code when referring to Mexicans. He told WTTW, these people ruin the buildings. They don't care about where they live or how they live. And so if he had any positive impact at all, it was that these types of comments helped spur the formation of at least 7 to 8 housing activist organizations in Pilsen. I'm going to try to end quickly. The 18th Street Development Corporation, one of these organizations, was a political organization. Their flyers borrowed from the United Farm Workers Si Se Puede call, joining it with a symbol of the historic housing and buildings that gave Pilsen its character and housed thousands of ethnic Mexicans. The Alianza de Viviendas y Negocios de Pilsen, shown here with a kind of a flyer for a rally, had a membership of housing activists who were committed to challenging zoning changes that were being weaponized against the community. But as much as they disliked Podmajersky and his attempt to flip Pilsen from a Mexican colony to an artist colony, they understood that it was Chicago 21 and its host of corporate investors that were the real threat to Mexican Pilsen. This was the powerful market gaze that laid its vision on an area of comfortable proximity to downtown along the Chicago River and peopled by vulnerable residents who were presumed to have no political power or voice. In order to respond to Chicago 21, the housing activists needed help. They turned to an unlikely ally. Just directly north of them, the University of Illinois at Chicago Circle campus. Cesar Olivo, pictured here, was a Chicano planning student, and other like-minded folks began to collaborate with the faculty and the grad students of I'm going to call it UIC for short, of UIC, basically asking them to work with them to stop Chicago 21. At that time, the community was pretty leery of working with the University of Illinois. If you read my book, you'll realize why. Before Pilsen becoming a kind of predominantly Mexican community, they lived mostly in the near west side, an area just north of Pilsen, and that place became a site of urban renewal. It displaced thousands of Mexican immigrants and other communities of color, and and then the mayor gave that land to the University of Illinois. So when Olivo tells the community, we're going to work with the University of Illinois, that doesn't bode well with the community. But he was right. What he was trying to tell the community was, people feel what we're trying to do here in Pilsen, meaning that urban planning at UIC was undergoing a massive change within its culture. They were interested in decolonization movements around the world. The grad students were reading Jane Jacobs, Frantz Fanon, Paulo Freire. They were applying a kind of world systems approach to equitable planning. And Olivo understood that, and Olivo tried to use that to bring it to Pilsen. A grad student working within this department, and this is one of the meetings to pelear Chicago 21, to fight Chicago 21. One of the grad students, Patricia Wright, a young grad student, and her peers and professors joined the fight to stop Chicago 21. Pilsen Neighbors Community Council held meetings to educate the residents and really to kind of mobilize a kind of counter plan to not only stop Chicago 21 but then produce a community plan with input from residents that would be called Pilsen Plan. That plan had a very different vision than Chicago 21. Whereas Chicago 21 envisioned the river as a kind of promenade that would lend itself to this kind of, it would be lined by condominiums. The Pilsen Plan used the streets that were already there and vibrant, and wanted to imagine them as a kind of open space, a kind of zócalo or meeting space for gatherings, rallies, organizing. And so it was a very different plan from the plan that that the city's land speculators and real estate investors imagined. In short, to just kind of close here, the plan was stopped and Pilsen Plan was adopted. The community was able to not stop Podmazierski, but they were able to stop the city from imposing its will upon the people of Pilsen as it imposed its will upon other areas around Chicago Central City. The book is loaded with a diversity of ideas from a very messy, complicated community of people, right? Like any other community. So you might imagine that as much as I'm telling you that Mexicanos in Pilsen stopped the master plan, if you read my book, you'll realize that there are other actors within the book that are like, you know what, bring the market here. We need this kind of investment. And there are other actors who were basically trying to create Pilsen as a site for tourism and a neoliberal investment. And they saw that as a positive thing. And so I hope that we can kind of flesh some of this stuff out with Professor Lopez today. But I will stop there so that we can get to our conversation. Okay? So thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you so much. It's so exciting to, it's so exciting to have somebody here who knows so intimately the history of how a place is made, right? The specific, nested, local history of how a place is made, and from often the margins. So thank you for that talk, because that was a really great way for us to begin. Also, I have the book here so that you guys can get excited about getting your own copies. So let's actually stick with Pilsen for a minute before we move more broadly to the book. I did put together just a few images of Casa Aztlán, which you see behind you. These is from Google Street View. When I was in Chicago, I lived in Chicago in 2011, and I remember walking in front of this building. I'll qualify that in a sec, because I know you're already thinking something.
Oh,
But
yeah,
I remember walking in front of this building in 2011 and thinking, wait, excuse me, right? It was on a relatively narrow street. So even though it looks very prominent, it's not sort of on a corner, right? It's just on a street. It's in the middle of a block. And I walked by and I thought, wait, what? And then I walked in, walked up some stairs, and there was a big auditorium in the back. Some folks that were there told me that there were English language classes on the third floor, and that when it had been a Bohemian settlement house, when it had been used by the people from what was then referred to as the Bohemian region, there had also been an English language class on the third floor. And so it was this really, and that was like in the 1890s, 1900s, 1910s. So it was this mind-blowing continuity of use over 100 years, even though it had changed hands in terms of who was using it and the languages that were spoken. Okay, so this is Google Street View today-ish. But if you go back to when Google Street View starts, you can see 2007, 2009, that looks like it's basically the same, although if you look closely, you'll see that in 2009, they did repaint it. So you can see it's crisp, right? There is an effort being made in 2009. And then if you go from 2009 to 2017, that is when it was bought by developers and turned into, I believe, condos. And they painted it over in that gray, which, by the way, for those of you who think gray is a benign color, okay, gray and dark gray is like the symbol of gentrification. And you can see in the slide above, there's even that tube where they like threw all the stuff from the building into the dumpster, right? So the reason I am bringing this up is because, so I put for you side by side the earlier mural from 2009 with what then they did to right their wrong, right? They repainted the mural on the building after they got an uproar about having taken it away. And I just was wondering if you could kind of comment on this issue of continuity over the generations and ethnicities and migrant streams, but then also total rupture.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's incredible to see these images, Sarah, in this way, because I have seen them many times over, but forget how dramatic the changes are. And also, you remind me of how when it was called Hull House, it was a site for kind of Americanization programs. But as many activists told me when I was researching this book, they would correct me. We did not continue Americanization programs. We turned it into a Chicanoization program. So it was a place of liberation, but also a new kind of education for a younger generation of Mexican Americans. Yeah, I mean, Casa Aztlán, the symbol of the Chicano movement in Chicago and in the greater Midwest, right? This is a building that gets taken over by young activists because they feel like that building, which used to offer social services, those services are not relevant to the community, right? And so they take it over, they occupy the building.
From who?
From the longtime social service agents that worked there. Some were white, some were Latinos. This is in the early 70s, and they just kick them out. Like they're like, well, we're federally funded, we can't be kicked out. We'll get out still, get out. And so they kick them out. They take over the building, and then through a kind of mural program, they adorn it with all these great murals. It's not even the murals really from 2007 are the ones from back then, right?
Right.
But still, I think you see a building like this, and this is very characteristic of Pilsen, colorful murals that adorn old 19th century buildings of the Bohemian era, right? These some of them are Victorian buildings, some of them are kind of like Romanesque buildings. And then it is pretty jarring to then see that gray, which does mean the gentrifiers have arrived, and we're here, and guess what? We want this building, and we're gonna color it whatever the hell we want, but we're not gonna color it that, because that reinforces that it's a Mexican neighborhood, right? And in many ways, Pilsen is slowly going through that process, a very painful process in which you walk down Racine, right that block, and it doesn't quite look like it might have looked when you were there in 2011 or in 2001 or when I first visited Pilsen in the 1990s, which that made sense there back then. And now the gray is starting to match other gray buildings and other businesses that aren't quite linking up or matching with the legacy of Mexican Pilsen. So,
Yeah, I mean, one thing for me is that when you see, I mean, even though there was a different group of people that transferred, the use of the building from one group to another, it was used as this sort of settlement house type building, or whether it had a more kind of revolutionary bent to it. Whereas once that use disappears and it becomes condos, and I think we see that with other examples in your book, where there are these cultural centers, there are these places for organizing that seem to have been eliminated, right? That program has been eliminated. So to me, that also seems like one of the kind of risks of the current moment, is where can those things then now happen?
Right.
Okay, so I was very, glad, and I found it to be so useful and helpful that your book addresses many neighborhoods in Chicago. Can you talk a little bit about limiting your case study to Chicago and what having an urban history of these various neighborhoods allowed you to argue by looking at all of these discrete neighborhoods and not, for example, writing a whole book about Pilsen and Little Village?
Yeah. So, I was born and raised in Los Angeles, and we have just shelves and shelves of LA Chicano history. It's a rich plethora of scholarship that I didn't grow up reading, but I mean, in college, I just found it so inspirational. I thought, wow, like this is about Chicanos and Chicanas in LA. This is amazing. And just some of my advisors that were writing some of the scholarship, I thought, this is so cool. This is like about my community, my neighborhood. Like we're in the history books, And I eventually, that became a kind of like an intellectual mission for me to want to historicize Latinos, Latinx people, Mexican Americans in Chicago, Mexicanos, who I thought when I first got to Chicago, I thought, my God, like it's so Mexican here, but no one's talking about it, and there's no scholarship on this. I mean, there was some, but not a lot. And so, for me, it made all the sense in the world to write an entire book on Mexicans in Chicago, as opposed to, say, like the Mexican diaspora in like Chicago, Detroit, and I don't know, St. Louis, although that could be really cool. There's a student out there doing that. I would be down to advise that or something. But anyways,
You're like, just saying.
yeah, just saying. But and then but yeah, I mean, there could absolutely be books that are solely cited in Pilsen or Little Village also, and we need those books for sure. There should not be five books or one book or whatever, right? We need a lot of scholarship because when this again, it's like when I was this or when I was that. Like when I was in grad school, I would ask my advisors like, hey, are there any cool books on Chicago that I should know? And they would be like, Mike, the whole freaking field is on Chicago.
Right.
And I think like my question was wrong. Like, of course there's a plethora of books on Chicago. Chicago is this amazing city, but it's also a very vicious city in its segregation, in the ways that it has replicated forms of containment for Black people for years, right? Like right after the Civil War, and so I was asking the wrong question. What I meant was like, where's a book there that's like on race, ethnicity, but it's on like on Latinos. And so I just thought like it just makes sense to write a book like this. And the only way I could kind of like situate it and frame it in my mind at the time, and maybe this is my own limitations, is that I just wanted to go through the neighborhoods. Let me move the chronology ahead, but let me also stop at different neighborhoods to show you what's taking place. I would say that the book, though, is really, it does take into account U.S. history. And in the book, you'll get a sense of like federal decisions being made in D.C. that will affect Chicagoans. So it's not a global history and it's not a transnational history in that way, but it is a national history of Latinos in a city.
Well, so one of the things about you going from neighborhood to neighborhood that was so cool, and I'd like you to help, sort of us and those of us in the audience who haven't read the book understand a little bit the time frame of some of these changes, but is seeing the kind of continual displacement that happened. So you talk about the story of people settling, in one neighborhood and the specifics of how the displacement there happened, only to resettle in the next neighborhood, and the specifics of how that displaced, only to resettle. I mean, really, the story is one of this, it's almost like the story is one of a continuous migration.
Oh, yeah.
Right? If we think about sort of migration being another term for displacement. So people are coming from Mexico, and people are also not coming from Mexico. They're born in Chicago, and they're experiencing this kind of migratory existence. So that was something that, really came to the fore when you did it the way you did it, where it's neighborhood by neighborhood. So talk a little bit about some of those federal programs that you're talking about, or the kind of immigration regime. You have an amazing part in chapter 2 on the kind of detainment, the deindustrialization of these facilities, and then the detainment of persons. And I see that almost as like the first big violent expulsion. So maybe you can expand on that a little.
Yeah. I always wanted to write about urban renewal and the ways that urban renewal was kind of felt on the ground from a kind of Latino perspective. And in doing my research, I realized like, whoa, wait a minute. When you kind of like look at these neighborhoods and you kind of overlay urban renewal's target for slum clearance and also places in which the federal mass deportation campaign known as, and I apologize for the name, it's an ugly name, Operation Wetback in 1954, when it was started on the West Coast, and it moved its way through the Southwest and then into the Midwest. By the time it gets to Chicago, the federal agents locate the near West Side as the key site in which they can find and possibly deport, in their numbers, 1 million undocumented Mexican immigrants. That was their goal. And in fact, when Joseph Swing is interviewed, this is the INS director at the time, he says, they live in all these slums in the near West Side, and they're easy to find. We just, this is the one spot. They're easy to find. And I just thought, wow, that's amazing. That's it's not just urban renewal displacement, but it's this mass deportation campaign that really impacts, displaces, traumatizes this community. Not only the people that are being deported, of course, but the people that see the deportations take place, right? So their neighbors, they're people that live in their building, right? So I thought I really want to kind of give a historical account of that experience as best I could, you know. So I tried to find journalistic notes and just articles that would paint a picture. One of the really kind of sinister outcomes of this chapter of American history is that the local jail cells don't have any room for these Mexican bodies. They've run out of room in the 1950s. They've already jailed a lot of people of color in Cook County jail. So the INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, contracts these kind of deindustrialized warehouses. One of them in particular is the Studebaker car plant. Now, you might not know what a Studebaker car is, but it used to be a brand or a model of a car in America that just did not compete with Chevrolet and all the other big ones. So it was on hard times. And INS contracts their facility to cage and detain Mexican immigrants. They use that facility, one, because it's empty, and two, because it's right next to Midway Airport, where they can, in quick fashion with no due process, detain them and then fly them out of Midway to the U.S.-Mexico border, put them on trains, and send them into the interior of Mexico. I found that really fascinating, and I thought, whoa, this is crazy.
Yeah.
I need to write about this. Yeah.
That part, that's chapter 2, by the way, and it's completely mind-blowing. It's completely awesome. And one of the things it did for me, as somebody who has worked on immigrant detention myself, is it made me realize how little I know about what's happened in the interior in immigrant detention in the 50s, because those histories have not been written as much as they should have been. And we spend so much time, figuring out what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border, what's happening also a little bit on our northern border. And I read that and I thought, oh, wow, what else don't I know, right? Just the taking of these recently emptied out warehouses and the quick succession of then repopulating them from cars to other service industry parts with people, right? As this kind of building up of the capacity for the federal government to do its thing. So that to me was a really poignant example of also how your book connected these federal policies, these kind of macro policies with these really specific local manifestations. Okay, I have maybe 1 or 2 more questions, and that's it, and then I'm going to open it up. So you said toward the end of your talk, and I do have a bunch of slides of buildings he mentioned in his talk. If you guys would like to see some of them, I can always show that as well. But you mentioned at the end of your talk that there are other actors. You were talking to us about Pilsen and the activism and in that particular case, at that particular moment, the successful activism, right? Even though we know that since then a lot's happened. Anita?
Yes.
So tell us about her. Tell us about how you met her. And she's an actor that played a very different role in Little Village. For those of you who know Chicago, equally important to Pilsen. So maybe you can kind of present that counter narrative.
Yeah. So one of the main kind of protagonists of my book is this real estate agent. She was one of the first of her kind, I think, Latina real estate agent who got her license in the 1950s. She lives in the near West Side. She herself is displaced by urban renewal. She has a large family. She's got a business in the near West Side as well. One of the things that makes her very interesting, though, is that in the 1940s and 50s, she is really connected to kind of the policies of what we would call the New Deal, right? So she's for public housing. She, in fact, writes up a mini study for the city to explore the possibility of building public housing for Latinos um, who are going to be displaced by urban renewal. In fact, she is actually somebody who thought maybe urban renewal is going to be a good thing because it might bring some updated housing to our neighborhood, you know. So she's coming out of that train of thought. But when she experiences urban renewal and Operation Wetback, and a lot of her neighbors are deported, she in fact adopts two of the children of a colleague or a camarada refugio who gets deported and later dies during the deportation process. Um,
He
she
dies on the plane.
He dies on the train,
On the
actually.
train.
Yeah, he's flown, put in a train to Tamaulipas. He has a massive heart attack on the train. This is a guy who was persecuted for years by the federal government for being a radical union activist with the packing house workers. And it's a tragic story. And he dies. He leaves two young daughters behind. Anita adopts those two girls, and she then gets kind of tagged with being a radical Mexican immigrant, although she's not an immigrant. She was born in the Midwest. So they can't deport her, but also she's just trying to make a living. And she becomes a real estate agent. So as Mexicans are being displaced out of the Near West Side and it pushed into Pilsen, she is kind of these pioneering real estate agents who is doing that pushing. And she's pushing into the Southwest Side. Now, if you know anything about the Southwest Side during these years, this is an area of predominantly Polish American, Czech, Bohemian, Slavic, Irish Americans who themselves are experiencing a kind of realignment of political behavior. They used to be union organizers, or rather union members, but they are seeing that the city is addressing kind of racism and segregation. Martin Luther King in 1966 visits these neighborhoods. They throw bricks and bats at him. They taunt the civil rights movement. So this is a place that's hostile to any kind of racial progress on housing or civil rights, right? This is also the place Anita is walking into. She is not a very big woman. She's a short brown woman walking into these communities, asking if they want to sell their home to her. Mm-hmm. So she gets sued, she gets protested by white groups, but what she's doing is she's opening up the Southwest Side block by block, buying properties from anxious ethnic whites who want to leave the city, and then she's then selling them to Mexicanos, right, who are eventually being squeezed because they can't live near downtown anymore, and they got to live somewhere. The city still needs their labor, right? So she's somebody that by the 60s and 70s is not really a believer in not only in the New Deal, but not even in Johnson's Great Society program. She is full on free market capitalist, and she's somebody that would have told the Pilsen Aztlán coalition, trust me, you want the market here. When they were like, the market gaze is going to kill us and it's going to displace us, and so that's part of the tension in the book itself, and yeah, Anita's story is amazing and incredible and controversial.
I love how you write pry open, right? That people like her were prying open the gates to the possibility of living in different houses in different places in the city. Like you said, block by block, parcel by parcel. And also what you just described raises for me, which also the book does, this question of to what extent can one person versus the social movement versus real estate agent conglomerates, to what extent can one person make these inroads, make these transformations? And then of course we can also compare that question, to what extent could one person do that in the 1970s to what's happening now in terms of with global capital and how things are shifting hands so quickly. So that was just such a good lesson that I took away from that work. And I also heard you say in the other meeting that you met her through her daughter, which was a beauty queen contestant.
Yes, I did.
That was kind
That's
of
how
cool.
yes.
Yeah.
That's how I came across. I
So
was,
you interviewed her, you know her.
no, she had
Okay.
passed away already.
right.
She passed away, I believe, in 2001, so a long time ago. But I did meet her daughter, who I was working on an article about beauty pageants. She had won a beauty pageant contest in the 1950s. And then she said, "What do Mike? What are you working on?" I was like, "Well, I'm writing a book on Mexicans in Chicago." And she said, "Oh, well, of course you know about my mom."
Right.
And I was like, "No, I don't know. Who's your mom?" And so that's when I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh my God, this is
Yeah.
amazing."
Yeah.
But I do take your point about to what extent can one person make all this change. I think like that is certainly something that is not. I don't know if that's what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to show how one person, their business savviness teaches an entire industry that's already kind of built on exclusion and segregation and racism, a mostly white real estate industry to say like, yeah, like let's be doing what she's doing because she's selling homes and we're not. So, but it does change the industry in Chicago. Yeah.
So I have several more questions that I'm not going to get to. Um, does anybody out there have any questions for Mike before I ask maybe one more? Or if you do, raise your hand and we can go ahead and take it. Yeah? Yeah. Akira?
Do you wanna just ask your question?
No. Go ahead. And I'll still, please.
Thank you for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I wanted to ask more about the contemporary Chicago scene and migrations and whether you see any connections. When you're talking about the detainment in Studebaker, and you're thinking about current
Right.
migrants who are
Yes.
forcibly housed in police stations and
Right.
other
Right.
less than hospitable places in Chicago today. Do you see any sort of like parallels there, or do you see maybe under the Johnson administration some changes in how people are being welcomed and, for lack of a better term, integrated into the broader Chicago?
That's a great question, Akira, because it's definitely something that's like in the news right now and on my mind for sure. This idea of a migrant crisis in Chicago, with in particular with the Venezuelan migrants who are sleeping in front of police stations, and of course the kinds of the politics over resources that emerge from different communities, right? In terms of like um, trying to address this crisis while also not addressing these longer crises of resources in Black and brown communities. I guess how I see it different is that there isn't one like spatial ethnic community that these migrants kind of belong to versus back in the 50s there were already kind of Mexican colonias, these sites that even the INS could identify as we should be looking here because this is where Mexicans live, right?
So convenient.
Super convenient, and they were able to weaponize that. I would say that the more recent Latinx migration, some of which comes under duress and traumatic, harrowing journeys, others who are just migrating through the kind of like whatever normal channels, are what do we have, right? We've got folks from Guatemala, El Salvador, people from South America, indigenous Mexicans from like Puebla, from Oaxaca, who are finding homes in all kinds of places in Chicago, in all the 50 wards, right? And I would even argue perhaps at the periphery of the city because the central city is so expensive. It's not affordable anymore. Um, and I guess in that way it's different. But yeah, I mean, I feel like the local response to a crisis and the fight over resources is something that's it does resonate with the past. There were all sorts of takes in the 1950s around The Studebaker plant. Well, why is it empty? Why are you putting these people in there? We should be producing stuff, right? We should be making things. And yeah, so I think that's something that I'm still mulling it over, but definitely there are some parallels historically, but something that's definitely on my mind for sure. Thank you, Akira. Yeah.
I had a question. I grew up in the Chicago public school system, and like my whole life, school was always racially quota, 30% white / Latino.
Yep.
And thinking back on it, we never learned the story of Latin migration, Latino migration to Chicago. We learned a lot about the Black migration and then like the history, music, food, and everything that came out of it for Chicago. And so I was curious, as a historian and someone who's wrote this book, how does that come to be that doesn't get integrated into our education when it's for the people sitting in the class?
Yeah. No, I know. That's a really, it's a question we need to keep asking because I think it's so true. Even now, right? I will talk to my teacher friends in Chicago who are like, Mike, how do I try to like grab some of this work that you've done and put it into my curriculum? It's not part of the CPS curriculum. And how do we make this knowledge more accessible so that we can teach it in the schools? I think that it's true. You can go through, you know, grammar school and then high school in Chicago and not learn any history of Latinx peoples. There was a time in LA when I also never learned anything about Latinx peoples in LA, and my high school was named LA High. I mean, like that's a problem. And so so I don't know a whole lot about how like states figure out curriculums. That's probably, there's probably awesome smart people in here that know how to do that. But I think that yes, there is a delay, right, between like the scholarship that's coming out and then how that gets incorporated into you know, like high school, middle school, grammar school curriculums. But it is a shame, right? Like there needs to be way more histories of Chicago that are, of course, like multiracial, multi-ethnic, that are showing how the city looks the way it looks today. I think it would be relevant to kids. It would be so more interesting probably than say like just learning about like, I don't know, some dude named, I don't know, I mean, name your dude, right? Cermak,
Name your dude.
right?
This is making me wonder, you know, there's a specific migration history of people coming from Mexico, just to still focus on Mexico, to Chicago, right? So we can talk about how not only there's a sort of this narrative of, oh, poor people are coming for work, is sort of this weird globalized, whitewashed narrative. But if you think about people being brought specifically to build the railroads, or if you think about the scouters who went to Mexico to recruit workers, to bring them up to build the railroads, or to break strikes in plants, you know, so that they were basically invited to Chicago to put their bodies on the line and have all of the workers who were trying to unionize hate them, and then quickly became Mexican, and Mexican quickly became a stand-in, as you beautifully wrote, and I even earmarked it, but I can't bend down, because about the way that Mexican has been used to collapse so many different meanings, you know, in terms of ethnicity and nationality and racialized, right? So I'm wondering, as you guys are talking about the curriculum, it's almost like you can't really teach about migration histories to cities and uphold the narrative that we still currently have about illegal, undocumented people as not deserving to be here. Because when you put that sort of historical capitalist lens on it, it just no longer is an argument that holds. And so it's like, I don't think we're ready to accept a different argument other than we need to be able to still, in 2023, turn the valve on and off for when we want bodies and when we don't want them. We're still totally in that moment. So that's how I see the curriculum fits with the moment we're in.
No,
Sadly.
that's true. Yeah.
So there was a question, yes, yellow jacket.
I'm curious how more recent policies in Chicago surrounding deconversion bans in both Wilson and Logan Square for taking like 2 flats and 4 flats and bringing them back to single-family homes, as well as I believe there is now a demolition charge in those areas. How that fits into your, I guess, thought of like looking at taking advertisement and how that relates to the city.
I mean, one really, I think, quick answer to that, which is a very smart question, is that these kinds of I would mostly call them venture capitalists who are buying up like buildings that need some work, but could be remodeled and then flipped on the market. They just kind of do whatever they want. So there might be some checks and balances within the zoning laws or even the policies within Chicago City Hall in terms of like, oh, you can't. You're going to have to pay this one penalty if you bulldoze this building, or you're going to have to write an environmental impact report if you do this to this building. And you know, I mean, they just do it. They're just like, yeah, we'll pay that penalty. Like, of course, like because the profit off of this is gonna be so juicy and good that it's gonna be worth doing it. I think that's kind of where we're at right now in terms of the thirst for uh, 2 flats, 3 flats in the central city of Chicago, not just, of course, Logan Square or Humboldt Park, but Pilsen, even Little Village. I mean, my God, like I used to think that the boundary was like Halsted and then maybe Ashland, but it's like deep. It's very deep. And why? Because a lot of these buildings, some of them can get gutted, but a lot of them are in fantastic condition, and people want them, right? And as a city, and even as a country, we're not really building affordable family units anymore. We're like it's all or nothing, right? It's like basically, it's McMansions in Texas or in Chicago, it's like luxury condos, but it's not your kind of historically your 3 flats that maybe you can fit like 6 families in them. So I think that people are just doing whatever they can because they have the resources. Those that are in the game of flipping properties, right? And it makes the central city unaffordable, inaccessible, and pushes communities that can afford the city into the periphery. And when I say that, I'm not really even talking about the suburbs per se, but even then, we're talking about kind of blue collar, working class suburbs that don't do the things that they used to do for previous generations of suburbanites, right? So even that story needs to be told too. But yes, I don't know if I answered your question, but yes, that's really important to think about. Oh,
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I have a question. My question is basically, what is your take on, what's your opinion on how much of the story of Latinos in Chicago is for segregation? Or, you know, this whole like, is it segregation, is it ethnic enclave? Particularly when it comes to the second generation and subsequent generation. For my research, I'm trying to disentangle like how much of this is immigrants and children. Like, obviously, that population is growing so much even now, but in your own, and this idea of like constant migration, like you were talking about succession. Yeah, I mean that's always the question I wanted to see your take on that.
yeah. So you know, I'm never gonna say that like the subsequent generations of say like Mexican immigrants, right? So like that second, third generation don't enjoy some social mobility in American life. Like in many cases, they do. In the case of Southern California, for instance, there are so many suburbs historically that are Mexican American, Chicano. You think of like Downey, Whittier,
Yeah.
you know, La Habra, or they call it Guadalajara these days. But anyways, But to me, the word segregation, while of course, like it's kind of like it's just a word like gentrification or whatever. It's supposed to explain some stuff, but sometimes it can be confusing. To me, that word is still holds true when we're talking about Latinos in housing, because historians for a long, long time used to not use that word, especially when talking about Latino residential formation, because what they were finding is that, oh, well, actually Latinos live with like some Irish people and some Polish people and some other kind of mixed ethnic enclaves. And that to me is not good enough. Like I still don't think that that explains. It doesn't say that all these people are on a level playing field and can do the same things with wealth. So in that sense, segregation is still a word I use for describing the communities that I'm talking about, even if they live in a kind of neighborhood mix of other ethnic whites or even African Americans, because as I show in the book, communities of color, and I'm talking about Latinos, they carry with them a kind of social tax, right? There's a tax, and there's limits to the kind of wealth capacity or wealth building that they can do. They in Pilsen in the 1960s and 70s, they fought so hard to get loans and to be seen as people of worth within a bank or a savings and loan institution, that struggle in and of itself is part of the struggle of segregation and battling redlining and the legacies of redlining. So I guess I'm a historian that thinks that we don't have enough histories of Latinx segregation, and we haven't even fully intervened in America's story of redlining. And that's kind of where I'm headed as a writer, I think, is to really reframe that segregation story, to put Latinx people back into the story, but yeah. Thank you.
Just one quick thing is that, as you guys were just talking about, I think one of the things that is, and you talk about this in the book, that is a kind of unique context for Latinx, but specifically Mexican segregation, is the way that there is a constant new migrant class. So you have these kind of migratory tensions, right, between the generations. And you have people taking different positions within the Latinx and Mexican community. And that is something that has continued to this day. So you have now, over 100 years of people newly arriving to Chicago. And the way that that gets used, not by the people necessarily inside the communities, but also by the people outside of them to lobby certain arguments, whether it's about illegality or whether it's about sucking on the coffers of the. So that relationship between newly arrived, have been a little bit longer, is a wicked relationship.
Yeah.
It's very complicated. And that's why, I appreciate you showing us a little bit about how that plays out in the struggles to have a home, right? And to make a place. The folks in Pilsen had only been there for 10 years when they were being told they had to leave. They put those murals on because that was a cheap and fast way to claim buildings. It's not just about cultural expression, right? That was an aha moment I had in his book, by the way. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I think there was.
Okay. Last question.
I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about the Chicago Real Estate Research Corporation.
Yeah.
I ask that just because personally I always get unsettled by being a practicing planner, going out to events that are hosted by the Urban Land Institute, basically like the current contemporary form of the National Association of Real Historic Boards that oppose public housing in the first place.
Right.
And so I just am curious and perked up. You talked a little bit about it. I was wondering if you could just share a little bit more about that institution. Is it still around in some different form in Chicago? And a little bit more about their
Yeah. No, that's great. I'll be quick. The Chicago Real Estate Research Corporation is the research arm of the Chicago Real Estate Board. Now, the board still exists, I believe, and they have tried to change their image, their public PR image, but I mentioned that they helped kind of institute the restrictive covenant that was really codifying into the property deed the unlawful sale to African Americans of homes. Right, this emerges in the 1920s, but you can imagine that in the 19 teens and 20s, these are essentially a group of white male real estate agents who control the industry in Chicago and are witnessing the arrival of tens of thousands of Southern black migrants from Mississippi, from Alabama, right? This is like the Great Migration Wave, folks that are populating and being steered into the south side of Chicago by black real estate agents, but also by these folks. They are indeed giving shape to the settlement of black Chicago, of the black metropolis. Don't take my word for it, just read The Black Metropolis. I mean, that book lays it out as to how you get Bronzeville and how you get these communities. These are places near vice districts. These are places that have the oldest housing. These are kitchenette homes that are just packed with families that are being squeezed into the buildings themselves. From there, you get, the second Great Migration. You get the concrete structures of public housing, but the whole time throughout the 20th century, the Chicago Real Estate Board and the Chicago Real Estate Research Corporation are trying to impact, affect, and shape housing policy for most of the 20th century. So in the 1960s, there is a kind of momentum by the Black freedom struggle in Chicago to open up housing, meaning that their campaign is like, we need to open these communities up by law, through the law, right, through the legal apparatus. The Chicago Real Estate Research Board sends lobbyists to Springfield, to City Hall. They got people everywhere to try to stop that, to try to kill that bill, and to shape the policymaking, right? This puts Mayor Daley in a bind because he needs black voters. He relies on a black constituency. He has a submachine of black leaders who are saying, hey man, we gotta support some of this stuff, like the optics are bad. So that's the tension in the mid-century years. But really, the answer to your great question is like, this is a powerful lobby group that is trying to give shape to a very multiracial Chicago without losing white Chicagoans. Basically, they're saying like, if it's just a kind of wild frontier for real estate agents and they can sell wherever they want, we're gonna lose the whites in the city. They're gonna be gone, right? And how do we make our money? And so this is a struggle over resources, over who controls that market. The person I write about, Anita Villarreal, she gets sued by these folks. She then countersues through HUD. She files a complaint. So they're trying to stop her too. But don't get it mixed up. It is solely focused on where black people live. But in the minds of the Chicago Real Estate Research Corporation, they feel like if Latinos arrive, that's step one. And then it's, African Americans arrive here too, right? This is like the thinking that really goes back to the mid-century years, and in the Southwest Side, it really takes root in how do you keep Gage Park white? How do you keep Marquette Park white? How do you keep Brighton Park white? How do you keep these neighborhoods white? That's the question that they're trying to ask and answer. I hope I offered some insight into that thinking. Yeah.
Are there any questions that we should have asked? Burning questions you always wanted to be asked about your book?
Well, no, but I would say that you reminded me in your last comment about how the kind of like the continual migration, right back to your question about the second generation, third generation, that Mexican immigrants that have been arriving just every decade, right? And mixing with kind of longtime Mexican Americans, that in my book, what I show is that a lot of different stakeholders are kind of trying to speak for them. And I would say that there's a great way in which your book, and in particular your chapter on Chicago and Mexicanos, they speak for themselves. And you really show like, hey, we're from Michoacan and we're going to organize as people from Michoacan, or we're from Guanajuato, or we're from Zacatecas. And guess what? We care not only about what's happening in Chicago, we also care about Zacatecas and Michoacan. And we're going to send our money over there to fix a road, build a soccer field, and also build something here. So I think in that sense, I think that's how I think our books are in synergy. You're really giving voice to that population that for me, I think I'm just showing the nefarious parts of how people speak for these communities without really consulting them. And I think you're consulting these communities, you know,
So the takeaway is you should also read my book.
Exactly. The remittance landscape.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you.